I just had to eke them out, and I just had to ask myself the right questions, and I had to keep thinking about my relationship with Dad and how we move forward.
Faith at the Fringe, a Sanctuary First podcast series. Uncovering God in the creative arts. At the biggest international arts festival in the world, Sanctuary First stops to ask, where does faith and art meet?
Welcome to Faith at the Fringe, a Sanctuary First podcast that seeks to engage with musicians, artists and creatives who have come to the Edinburgh International Fringe Festival. I'm Albert Bogle, and today I'm joined by Jon Lawrence. Jon is a Welshman, and he's an author, a poet, a playwright and a musician who has been educating learners of all ages for the last 5 years and more. And I'm delighted, Jon, that you're able to come and be part of this podcast today. There's lots we could talk about because you've got quite a backlog, an extensive catalogue of things that you're involved in. Could you maybe just tell our listeners a little bit about who you are?
Well, I suppose my background is in music. That's where I trained. I trained as a musician. But I soon got to the point where I wanted to find out a little bit more about the characters that I was writing in my songs about. I wanted to know a little bit about their backgrounds and their histories. Because when you write a song, you've got 3 minutes to say something profound or maybe even earth-shattering, which is why John Lennon's Imagine is so wonderful. And it's a real art to say so much in such a small space of time. And I did that for a long time, but what I wanted to do was to look at writing, because I could instead of taking a big idea like World Peace that Lennon wrote about and condensing it into 3 verses, I wanted to go the other way, start with a small idea and a seed of an idea, if you like, and then see how it grew as a writer. And that's when I started to write short stories, which then became novels, novellas, and working with children, I had the opportunity to write some plays for some schools, for the school I was working at. So they became musicals, and that got me interested in writing for the stage, and now I write for the stage as well. So I do lots of different things. I've had lots of great opportunities. And I'm curious about everything. So that's my reason for doing all these things. I'm a jack of all trades, master of none.
It's a good thing for a writer to be curious, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because it gives you an opportunity for imagination to be developed and to grow and to be open to ideas and.
Well, that's what being alive is. It's having an idea, having the imagination and following it. I sometimes get very frustrated that as a teacher, that the arts are just pushed aside in schools in favour of maths, English, computing, sciences. When the creative, some people are only creative. I was dreadful at school. My maths is dreadful. But I could write a story from a very young age, and I could write a song from an early age. But that's not recognised at the school, and so I had to find my place where my creativity would be, I suppose, acknowledged or appreciated.
Yeah, I think you make a good point there, and even within the sciences and maths and all that, there is a creativity that is there to be unlocked. But the problem is that the way we teach these topics, we don't allow that creativity to come And as someone, we're talking about a faith podcast here, but the interesting thing for me is that I believe we're made in the image of God, who is a creator, and the creative spirit of God, that we're made in his image, and that creative need to create is part of how God has made us in his image. And therefore, I think we miss out in the human potential when we don't honour creativity. And I think you're absolutely right to mention that and to bring that out for our listeners to start thinking about just the importance of the creatives among us. And often they're struggling, aren't they, to make ends meet, because we're so driven to be creating jobs, to create wealth, to create more things, more stuff like that, rather than.
Well, I mean, there's a great film called Dead Poets Society, and there's a lovely line in there which sums it up for me. When Robin Williams is talking to a bunch of students, and he's talking to them, he's trying to enthuse them about poetry, and he says, maths, English, people, if you want to go into business, architecture or banking, whatever, these are all very noble pursuits, and they are essential for sustaining living, sustaining life. But, the arts, poetry, love, that is what we live for. That is life. Mm-hmm. And for me, that's where I feel most alive, when I'm listening to music, when I'm writing, when that side of my brain, which is creating, when that's working, that's when I feel most alive.
Yeah, and I think it's back to that old adage I often say to people, science tells us how things work, engineering tells us how things work, but we're all searching after the why. Why am I here? What's the purpose of this? Where am I going? And what will my life have achieved? And how will it have achieved anything in community to be part of this, not on your own? Yeah. We're not people. We're not made to be people who live on our own, but we're made to live in community. And how do we foster that whole area of community and allow these gifts and talents within people to be explored? I noticed that one of the things that you've been talking about too is you've been working with children. How does that inspire you?
Well, children are the real joy in my life. Particularly, they're really young kids that I work with, the preschool children, the primary school children, because from them you get pure enthusiasm. They just appreciate the simple things, like a silly song, a funny face. I've been doing shows here at the Fringe as the music man, and all I've got to do is bang my head on the microphone, and people erupt in laughter, and you can't beat the sound of children laughing. It's the best sound. And I mean, I started working as a lecturer in colleges and universities, and very quickly became disillusioned with it. And then one day I was asked by my son's nursery, they said, "Can you come down and just sing a couple of songs with the kids?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." So I went down and sang the old Twinkle, Twinkle and Old MacDonald, and started to realize how much I enjoyed it, because you just get that pure enthusiasm. They don't care whether it's cool music or whether it's even good music. All they care is that they're involved in the process of having fun and making enjoyment. And so that led on to me staying at that little nursery and just doing it week after week. And then that became another nursery, then another play school, and then another preschool, and another school. And next thing I know, I'm performing to children in New Zealand, and it's gone all the way around the world. And everywhere I go, it's exactly the same thing. They just want to be entertained. They don't care what's cool. They just want to have fun. And I love making that happen.
You know, I was just thinking there again, maybe faith connection here is, of course, Jesus seemed to have loved children. And when the adults and the people around him said, you can't bring the children here, Jesus said, let the children come to me, for such is the kingdom of God. If you want to know about God and you want to know about life, start with the children. And he brought a child into their midst and said, except you become as a child, you'll never enter the kingdom of God. And I think what he was trying to say there is, back to what you were saying, is there is a simplicity and an honesty in children. They tell you what they think, but there's an honesty and acceptance of what you offer.
Which we very quickly lose, and sadly, which, when we are jaded by experience and some of the difficulties that we later face in life, we lose that beautiful naivety, if you like, but that's why I love children, because they're honest, they're true. Some of them are demanding, but they give me life. They sort of give me energy and a reason to get up in the morning.
I think you're onto something that's very, very important for life, and we neglect the children at our peril, and society neglects the children at their peril, and we neglect our own children and our grandchildren. If we neglect them, it's a peril, because they're longing for deeper relationships. We just finished a podcast there with someone was talking about when Thera Heard met Kurt Cobain, and it's an interesting thing to these two people. Yeah. One was grounded in her faith, in the Methodist faith, but she had so much compassion in this conversation with Kurt, who was someone who had a very happy childhood up until he was 9, and then his parents divorced, and he never wanted his parents to be divorced. He was longing for them to be together again, and it works out this longing for rolling back to what it was, what he had lost. Which gets me maybe coming to the next area that we might want to talk about, which is the more serious thing that you've been engaged with, is this book that you've written, Good Grief, but also the play that you've brought to the festival here, Good Grief. Can you tell us a little bit about this and why you got involved in writing it?
Well, I lost my father in 2017, late 2017. He had cancer, and we had a strange sort of relationship. We loved each other, but we didn't always get on. We were very different characters. My dad was very sort of stoic, sometimes quite formal, very proud, pragmatic. I'm the complete opposite. I'm, wear heart on the sleeve, and so sometimes we did clash. But we just about got there at the end, and then the grief hits. I'd lost my mother in 2015 after she had a stroke in 2002, and so I kind of lost most of that person when she had the stroke, and then she died in 2015, and then I'd also lost a friend in the 9/11 attacks. We'd lost a child, and so grief seemed to be, it felt like it was following me almost. And I thought, I need to get a handle on this, because, with the with the depression that I was suffering, I thought this could get out of control, so I need to get a handle on it. So one of the things I started doing was writing poetry, not about trying to address grief head on, but rather, let's take some of the nuances of grief, some of this particular aspects of grief. So maybe, I started writing about, there was a poem about selling the house after Dad died. Just that little section of grief, trying to understand what's happening there. There's another one which is all about the wake. How do you deal with a wake after a funeral? You've got all that planning and stuff to do when you're most confused in many respects. So I'd started writing those, and then, when just before Dad had passed away, we were sat in Leicester Royal Infirmary. We were having a chat, and he asked me what I was going to spend the money on, my inheritance money. And I said, well, I'd rather not talk about that, to be honest, Dad. But I could see he needed to know. And so I said, I could clear off a couple of debts and it'd be nice to take the family on holiday. He said, yeah, good idea. And then I said, well, I could do that trek, because I had planned to do a trek about 5 years or so earlier through the Sahara for the Stroke Association, but it all fell through for various reasons. So I said to Dad, look, I can do that now. I can use some of that money. And he said, yeah, okay. But I said, if I want to raise some money for, in this case, the Big C charity, a Norfolk cancer charity, then it'll need to have maybe a bit more scope, a bit more scale. So I said to him, I'll do 5 treks on 5 continents, 5 deserts, 100 kilometers in each, so 500 kilometers. And he said, yep, sounds good. That was my dad's ringing endorsement. And that's what I did. So I started planning for it, and within 9 months, I did my first trek. So that's how it all came about. Is a way of trying to understand the grief while raising some money. It just seemed like I could do 2 things at once.
So did you raise a lot of money?
I can't remember. I think it was about 8,000 in the end, something like that.
Wow.
But for me, it was even more valuable.
Yeah.
Because each of those deserts, one of the reasons for going to the desert is because I struggle sometimes with all the hullabaloo of the noise that's around us. The sounds of vehicles beeping as they're reversing, and pumped up noise in shops that you don't really need to hear, and beeping phones, and all this sort of stuff sometimes gets too much for me. And I thought, I need some mental space and some physical space. And so, the desert gives you that in spades. So I went, first of all, to the Atacama, and that's where I found some beautiful silence, some real silence. And that gave me the opportunity to start, just thinking about my relationship with Dad, the things that had worked well, things that hadn't worked well. One of the things that came through when I was doing those treks was, some of the reasons that I didn't get on with Dad was because he denied me certain things. And at the time, I didn't know why he was doing it. You can't do this. And I thought, well, why not? And it would be because I said so. But then, as I had kids of my own at this point, and I was starting to realize that a lot of those decisions that he made, I'm now having to make for my kids. Mm-hmm. And I'm finding myself saying, because I said so. Because sometimes it's too complicated, and it's too much hassle and time to sit down and explain why you can't have those new pair of shoes, or I never went without. My dad was incredibly generous, but there's some of the decisions that he made I found difficult. But when I started to walk those deserts, all of those decisions, all of them, started to make a lot more sense. And I wished I could have sort of said, I wish I could have made that discovery before he passed away, so I could say, yeah, I now know. I now understand.
Yeah, what's coming into my mind is Mike and the Mechanics in the Living Years. But John, do you know there's a link between Jesus walking in the desert and his father? There's a beautiful, beautiful bit in the Bible where Jesus has been baptized, mm-hmm. and the Holy Spirit comes down, and the voice from heaven says, "You are my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased." And Frank Lake, who was a clinician and a clinical theologian in the 1960s, wrote a whole thesis around the cycle of grace and the cycle of works. Mm-hmm. And he said that most of us have fathers who work on the cycle of works. So they start off with saying, you've got to achieve. Mm-hmm. And if you achieve, then that will sustain you, and that will give you prestige, and that will take you to the place of acceptance. And we work on this whole theory of achieving to please, mm-hmm. And why did Jesus cope in the desert for 40 days and 40 nights and go through the temptations? What sustained him was that he knew he was loved, because the cycle of grace works the opposite way around. It says, you're accepted. Regardless mm-hmm. what you do, you're accepted and you're loved. And that begins to give you a prestige and an understanding that I am, and that sustains you, and then it helps you to achieve. Mm-hmm. And it's a complete, the opposite cycle. And Frankly brought that out in one of his writings. And I was just thinking about you in that there's a kind of a nice link there about going and walking these deserts, and in order that you might maybe hear your father saying, "You're my beloved son in whom I'm well pleased."
Well, yeah, I don't know if I heard anything or if I believed anything. I think I was essentially having a conversation with myself, which some people might say is actually a conversation with God or Jesus, yeah. But I was trying to find out who I was, and there's the old joke that if you're walking through the desert that long, you'll be talking to Elvis, let alone anyone else. And when I was walking in the Sahara, I could kind of see that, because there was times when I was walking through the Sahara where everything, whichever way you look, 360 degrees, is exactly the same. And you have no idea. At midday, when the sun shines down on you and there's no shadow, west could be anywhere, and north isn't true. Mm. So, and at that point, you can see how people start to look inwards for help, or they look elsewhere to faith, to religion, to try and give them some answers. Now, I kind of was in my thought was that I had the answers within me. I wasn't necessarily looking for the answers from anywhere else. I knew they were in me somewhere. Mm-hmm. I just had to eke them out, and I just had to ask myself the right questions, and I had to keep thinking about my relationship with Dad and how we move forward, and how I honor him. So my thought of honoring him was raising money for this charity, but also thinking, well, how do I? There's a saying that some parents say to their kids: "Make your mistakes your own." Don't make the same mistakes that your parents make. And I was thinking, well, what can I learn from the way my relationship was with my father, and how I can address those with my own kids? Because those are the questions that I was sort of asking. And obviously about the grief, how am I going to get this painful feeling to go away? But I knew they were all within me. And I just thought, if I've got this space around me, and this quiet, and this time to think, we'd be walking for 8 hours a day, and then we'd go back to the tent, and then I could sit up and look at the stars, and And then all that space and time was what I needed. Now, I was very lucky to have that. Now, I know a lot of people would be struggling. You know, if you're in the centre of London and you've lost somebody, you need sometimes. I believe you need physical space as well as mental space, just to declutter as much as you can. And some people don't have that luxury. You know, I did, and I think I've sort of made the most of it.
So did you keep a journal then when you were going?
Yeah, and that's essentially what the book is. It's my thought processes as I'm going through, right from losing Dad all the way through each of those treks, and the preparation for the treks, and then each of the treks as well.
So coming to the festival and bringing this to the public, it must be quite tiring and pulling a huge amount of energy out of you and reliving some of this again.
Well, that was something I was concerned about, but I don't necessarily subscribe to the idea that I've got to relive it every time, because what I'm doing is, as I'm telling the story, I'm a narrator, so it's like I'm taking the role of a narrator rather than Jon. Right. So I can take a step back and tell the story. I think it would have been harder had it been the case that at the end of those treks, nothing had really happened for me. You know, but on each part of the treks, some of them were harder than others, I learned something about myself, or as I say, about the relationship I had with Dad, or about my dad. And I think, you know, that's the main thing for me, was to keep that in mind, that, you know, just make sure I'm learning something. And as I'm going through this play every night, occasionally, you know, there's a little bit of, it touches a nerve, and you think, well, hang on, I'm a bit close to that. So I sort of take a little step back and remember, you know, I'm telling a story now. Because I don't want to relive the pain of what happened. Nobody wants to relive the pain. But, you know, I have to address it to some extent so that I can show the journey from that pain through to, you know, coming to terms with what happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a very brave thing to do, to be able to do that, and to be able to share that with so many people at the Fringe. This revealing, I'm wondering again, there's a thing, you know, as a Christian, I think about the Spirit of God reveals things to us. I was saying earlier on, I was saying this in the last podcast too, that I think there's a lot that you were talking about within yourself, made in the image of God. We don't all get it right away. It's like a revelation, like something's uncovered, and we see another bit of the story, we see another bit of the story. And I'm wondering, could I be so presumptuous as to think, or are you thinking that as you come to Edinburgh and do this play, that there's something else going to be revealed to you? As because you were going expecting, you went on these journeys expecting something. You were not going without expectation in your heart, or you wouldn't have stepped out, because that was a faith thing, to step out and say, I'm going to do this. So the journey continues, because you've been talking about this journey. So is this journey of grief, of good grief? Because it's good. Are you really saying? Yeah, I want to hear how you are understanding good grief now.
Well, you know, yeah, it is a journey. I mean, what I've found with the grief is that it changes. Grief changes. At the start of my journeys, my grief was controlled by anger, resentment. I was angry at Dad that he hadn't gone to the doctors earlier, that he hadn't stopped smoking, for example. I was angry that I resented the fact that I didn't have more time. Silly things like, I'm the youngest of three siblings. Why did I end up with less time? You know, these silly things like that. But as I started to go through the process and go through different stages, different treks, particularly when I got to New Zealand, which is the place that I'd been with my father just before, not long before he passed away, where we'd really come to start to try to understand each other, and we talked more than we'd ever talked. And that meant that the New Zealand section of the treks was filled with happy memories, and those happy memories led on to other happier memories. And suddenly the grief turns from something negative to something positive. And I mean that in its truest sense. It's a positive thing, because that grief was a grief of pride. I was so proud of Dad. It was a grief of gratitude. So grateful that he did the things to put me through college, and I never went without, and you know, he loved me in his own way. But the love was the main thing, because you can't have love without grief. Love and grief are the same. And the more I consoled myself with the fact that the harder and more painful my grief was due to the amount that I was loved. You know, I was loved so much, so therefore I was going to be in so much grief. You can't separate love and grief. They're entwined like lovers.
Yeah. What a wonderful point to maybe stop this particular podcast. Perhaps on another time we can get a chance to talk further. Yeah. John, I would like to be able to do that. But it's interesting that you talked about the last thing was that you knew you were loved.
Yeah.
Which takes me back to my Jesus insight. You know, you are my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased. And I would like to think that your Father is looking down wherever he is and saying to you, you are my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased. But more than that, that one day, perhaps when you come, faith might come to you in a new way to discover this Heavenly Father that says the same about you. But that's why we preach a bit, John.
Yeah. We wait with bated breath.
Which I'm allowed to do. But thank you so much for being with us and sharing with us today. It's been a wonderful experience.
That's great. Thank you for having me.
And listen, I want to just thank our audience for looking in and listening. If you have been affected by some of the things you've heard and said, maybe you'd like to share some of that online with us. If you want to get in touch with us, of course, you can get in touch with us about something that's more personal at contact@sanctuaryfirst.org.uk. Otherwise, please put your comments on the website or on the app or on Facebook. And, of course, these podcasts do go out on Spotify and iTunes, and they are on our app and also on our website. So thank you for being part of our group. But before I do so, I want the last word to you, John, because I want you to be able to say where people can hear and engage with apart from buying the book, Good Grief, but also to come to the show.
Yeah, the show is on at Hill Street Theatre, 5 o'clock until the end of this the Fringe, and the book is available in all good bookshops.
So there you go, you've heard it from here, and until next time, God bless.